Following up on a breaking story we brought you yesterday at 5, that tragic case in South Haven that left a 20-year-old special needs woman dead and has her mother in jail tonight. 40-year-old Cynthia Clemons will be in court Wednesday after the family tells us her 20-year-old daughter, Mykryra Clemons' decomposing remains were found in a closet in the mother's bedroom. WRG investigator.
It all happened when her aunt went on Facebook and typed out words that shook the internet and broke the heart of people who saw it. "I'm so hurt. So you killed my niece, put her in a bag, and put her in a closet for a whole month when I'm one call away? I hate you." She loved her niece so much, and when she found out, it was already too late and in the worst possible way. For weeks, the family kept asking, "Where is Mykryra?" And every single time, they got the same answer over and over again. She is safe. She is staying with a woman who understands her condition better. Inside, the apartment felt wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, just off, like something had been left unfinished. A light was on in the hallway. The air was still, no movement, no voice calling out. There was a door. Behind that door was the closet. And inside that apartment, there was one detail that kept replaying in everyone's mind. She told them she was safe. So why hadn't anyone seen her? Before we get into this, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and join us. And tell me, where are you watching from around the world? Because what was about to be found in that closet would turn a simple welfare check into something no one expected. So how does someone disappear without ever leaving home? Mykryra Clemons was someone who needed the world to be a little gentler with her. She was a young woman, just entering adulthood, living in South Haven, Mississippi. At an age where many people are building independence, Mykryra's life looked different. She had Down syndrome, a condition that meant she relied heavily on others for daily care, structure, and protection. Simple routines, familiar faces, and a stable environment weren't just comforts for her. They were necessities. Those who knew her understood that. She wasn't someone who could easily speak up for herself in complicated situations. She depended on the people closest to her to make sure she was safe, fed, and cared for. Her world was smaller, quieter, and built around trust. Family members described her as someone who stayed close to home. Her days followed a pattern: meals, rest, familiar activities, and the presence of the same people she knew. Change wasn't easy for her, and neither was being left alone for long periods. That made consistency important. It made reliability important. And above everything else, it made trust important. At the center of that trust was her mother, Cynthia Clemons. As her primary caregiver, Cynthia wasn't just a parent. She was responsible for nearly every aspect of Mykryra's life. From basic needs to supervision, from communication with others to decisions about her care, everything passed through her. For someone like Mykryra, that kind of relationship isn't optional. It's survival. And from the outside, it appeared to be just that. But that kind of arrangement comes with something people don't always see. Dependence. Complete dependence. Because when one person becomes the sole connection between a vulnerable individual and the outside world, every question, every concern, every piece of information has to go through them first. And if something changes, if something goes wrong, it can take time before anyone else realizes it. That's what made this situation so fragile. Mykryra didn't have the ability to step outside that system and explain what was happening. She couldn't call for help in the way others might. She couldn't easily challenge what she was being told or what others were being told about her. Her voice, in many ways, was tied to the person caring for her. And that meant her safety depended on one thing: that the person responsible for her was telling the truth. Family members didn't have direct, constant access to Mykryra. Updates about her well-being often came through her mother. If someone asked how she was doing, where she was, or what she needed, the answers came from Cynthia. That wasn't unusual. It's often how caregiving situations work, when one person takes on the primary role. But it also meant something else. It meant that information flowed in one direction. If everything was fine, people accepted it. If there were changes, they were explained. And if there were questions, they were answered by the same person who controlled access in the first place. From the outside, there wasn't an immediate reason to doubt that system. Families rely on trust. especially when one person steps forward to take on full-time care. It allows others to step back, believing that the person in charge is doing what needs to be done. And for a time, that's exactly what seemed to be happening. There were no urgent alarms, no reports that drew immediate attention, no clear sign that anything was out of place. Just a mother caring for her daughter in a private space, managing things in her own way. But arrangements like this can become fragile without anyone noticing. When one person becomes the sole source of information, even small changes can go unnoticed if they're explained away. A missed call, a delayed visit, a vague update, on their own, they don't always raise concern. Especially when they come from someone the family already trusts. That's where the balance shifts. Because trust makes things easier, but it also reduces oversight. And when oversight fades, questions take longer to surface. Still, at this stage, there was no clear accusation, no confirmed wrongdoing. Just a structure built on dependence, and the quiet assumption that everything inside it was working as it should. And that trust would later become the biggest question in this case. By the time January came around, something had already begun to shift, quietly, without any formal report, without any clear announcement. Mykryra Clemons was no longer being seen. There wasn't a specific day when everyone suddenly realized she was gone. It didn't happen like that. Instead, it was gradual. A missed visit here, a delayed response there, a growing stretch of time where no one outside the home had direct contact with her. At first, it didn't raise immediate alarm. When family members began asking about Mykryra, where she was, how she was doing, Cynthia had an explanation ready. She told them that Mykryra was with another caregiver. According to what was shared, this caregiver also had experience with individuals who had Down syndrome. It sounded like a reasonable arrangement. Someone else stepping in to help. A change in environment, maybe even a temporary situation that could benefit her. There was nothing, at least on the surface, that immediately contradicted that story. And because of that, the family accepted it. But time has a way of exposing gaps. Days turned into weeks. And during that time, there were still no direct conversations with Mykryra, no confirmed visits, no independent reassurance that she was truly where she was said to be. At first, those details might have seemed minor. But as the weeks passed, they became harder to ignore. Family members began asking more questions. Simple ones at first. Where exactly is she staying? Can we speak to her? Can we visit? And while answers continued to come, they didn't always bring clarity. They filled the space just enough to delay deeper concern, but not enough to fully settle it. That's when the feeling started to change. It wasn't fear yet, not fully. But it was something close to it. A sense that something wasn't lining up the way it should. Because when someone is truly safe, when they're being cared for and everything is fine, there's usually some kind of confirmation. A voice on the phone, a quick visit, a simple moment that reassures everyone involved. In this case, that reassurance never came. And the longer it didn't come, the harder it became to ignore the silence. Still, there was hesitation. No one wants to assume the worst about someone they trust. No one wants to believe that something serious could be wrong, especially when the explanation, on the surface, still sounds possible. But doubt doesn't disappear once it starts. It grows. Quietly at first, then steadily. And eventually, it reaches a point where someone has to decide whether to keep accepting the answers or start questioning them. Because by the time March approached, the situation had gone from unusual to concerning. And one family member in particular could no longer ignore that feeling. But something about the story didn't sit right. By the time March arrived, the questions had been building for weeks. What had started as quiet concern had now turned into something harder to ignore. The explanations no longer felt complete. The time without contact had stretched too far. And for one family member, her brother, that feeling had reached a limit. He hadn't seen his sister. He hadn't spoken to her. And every answer he received seemed to leave out something important. At some point, concern becomes responsibility. Instead of asking another question, he made a decision. He called for a welfare check. That call changed everything. When officers arrived at the apartment on South Park Circle, there was no immediate sign of distress, no noise coming from inside, no indication from the outside that anything serious had happened. Just a closed door and a request to confirm that someone inside was safe. They knocked. No response. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Eventually, they made contact and were allowed inside. The apartment didn't look like a place where something had gone wrong. The space was intact, furniture in place, no visible damage, no signs of a struggle. Nothing that would immediately suggest an emergency. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary home. But welfare checks aren't about what's obvious. They're about what doesn't add up. Officers began asking questions. Where was Mykryra? That was the reason they were there. Cynthia gave an answer, similar to what the family had already been told. She said that her daughter was with someone else, another caregiver, someone who could take care of her. But this time the explanation didn't carry the same weight. Officers asked for more details. Where exactly was she staying? Who was this caregiver? How long had she been there? The answers came, but they didn't line up cleanly. There were gaps, details that shifted, information that didn't fully connect from one response to the next. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it was enough to raise concern. Because when a person is safe, especially someone who depends on care, the details are usually clear. There's a location, a name, a way to verify that everything is as it should be. Here, that clarity wasn't there, and officers could feel it. They weren't seeing evidence of a crime, not yet, but they were hearing something else: inconsistency. And inconsistency, in situations like this, matters. What began as a simple welfare check started to take on a different tone. The questions became more focused. The attention shifted from routine to careful observation. Something about the situation didn't match the explanation being given. And even though nothing obvious had been discovered inside the apartment, the answers themselves were beginning to tell a different story. At that point, officers knew something wasn't being said. The answers they were getting weren't enough. At that point, officers had a decision to make. They hadn't found anything inside the apartment that clearly pointed to a crime. No visible signs of violence, no immediate evidence that Mykryra was in danger. But the inconsistencies in Cynthia's statements stayed with them. And in cases like this, uncertainty doesn't mean you stop. It means you look closer. Based on what they had heard and what they hadn't been able to confirm, investigators moved forward with the next step. They obtained a search warrant. This wasn't routine anymore. This meant they now had legal authority to go through the apartment more thoroughly. Not just a walkthrough, not just surface-level observation, a full, detailed search. When officers returned, the tone had changed. Every room was checked carefully. Every space looked at with more attention than before. Drawers opened, areas examined, questions still in the back of their minds as they moved through the home. But as the search went on, nothing obvious appeared. No clear sign of Mykryra. No immediate evidence that answered the question they had come to solve. The apartment still looked the same. Quiet, still, intact. And that's what made it confusing. Because by this point, something clearly wasn't right. The timeline didn't make sense. The explanations didn't fully match. And yet physically there was nothing they could point to and say, this is it. Eventually, the search came to an end. Officers had to step back. From the outside, it might have looked like a dead end. A case built on concern, but without proof. A situation where something felt wrong, but nothing had been found to confirm it. So they left. And for a moment, everything went quiet again. But what no one realized at that time was just how close they had been. Because inside that same apartment, within the very space they had just searched, was the answer they were looking for. Hidden, unseen, missed. They walked away, not knowing they were standing just feet away from her. The next day, officers came back. This time, there was no assumption that everything would look the same. The unanswered questions from the first visit hadn't gone away, they had only grown stronger. Something had been missed, and now, the goal was to find it. The search began again. Room by room, space by space, they moved with more intention than before. Nothing was rushed. Areas that had already been seen were checked again, this time with sharper attention. Because in situations like this, it's not always what's hidden far away. Sometimes it's what's hidden in plain sight. The apartment was still quiet, no movement, no sound. Just the presence of officers moving carefully through a space that now carried a different weight. Then, they reached it again. The closet. It had been there the entire time, a normal part of the apartment. Nothing about it stood out during the first visit, just another door in a hallway. But this time, it wasn't overlooked. An officer stepped forward and opened it. Inside, there was something that didn't belong. A bag. Not placed casually. Not something you'd expect to see in that space without reason. It was positioned in a way that immediately drew attention. Something about it felt wrong, enough to stop everything else in that moment. The room seemed to narrow around that single discovery, and as officers moved closer, that feeling became certainty. What they had been searching for was right there. Inside that closet. Inside that bag. They had found Mykryra Clemons. There was no confusion now. The question of where she was had been answered, but in the worst possible way. The same apartment where her safety had been assumed had become the place where her life ended. And the same explanation that had been given to the family, repeated more than once, now stood in direct contrast to what had just been uncovered. She was safe. That's what they had been told. But standing there, looking at what had been hidden in that closet, the truth was impossible to ignore. She was safe, just not alive. The weight of that realization settled in immediately. This wasn't a disappearance. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something that had been concealed, kept out of sight while answers were given that led everyone in a different direction. And now, there was no more room for those answers. The focus shifted instantly from searching to understanding what had happened inside that apartment and how it had gone undetected for so long. Because what had just been found raised even more questions than before. How long had she been there? What led to this? And why had no one been told the truth? At this point, I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened here? Do you believe this was planned or something else? Let me know below. Because from this moment forward, the case would no longer be about finding Mykryra. It would be about uncovering everything that led to her being hidden in that closet. Once Mykryra Clemons was found, the situation shifted immediately. What had started as a welfare check was now a confirmed death inside the home where she had been living. The focus turned from locating her to understanding what had happened, how long it had been happening, and why no one had been told the truth. Authorities moved quickly. Cynthia Clemons was taken into custody and formally charged. The charges were serious: abuse of a vulnerable adult and tampering with evidence. Those two charges alone say a lot, without fully telling the entire story. Abuse of a vulnerable adult points to harm or neglect towards someone who depended on another person for care. In this case, Mykryra's condition meant she relied heavily on her mother for daily support, supervision, and protection. That charge suggests that something in that responsibility failed in a way that had severe consequences. Tampering with evidence raises another layer. It indicates that after Mykryra's death, there were actions taken that interfered with how the situation would be discovered or understood. It suggests that what happened wasn't immediately reported, and that steps may have been taken to conceal it. And based on what was found inside the apartment, that part was difficult to ignore. But even with those charges, there were still major gaps. At that point, investigators had not publicly confirmed exactly how Mykryra died. The cause of death had not been released. The timeline, when it happened, how long she had been in the apartment, remained unclear. Those details matter, because without them, there's a difference between what is known and what is assumed. In cases like this, it's easy for speculation to fill in the gaps. But investigations rely on evidence, medical findings, timelines, and verified facts that can be proven. At this stage, the charges reflected what could already be established, that Mykryra, a vulnerable individual, had not been properly cared for, and that her death had not been reported in a way that allowed immediate discovery. But the deeper question, the one that defines the case, was still unanswered. What actually happened inside that apartment? Was this a situation that developed over time? Was it something sudden? Was it something that could have been prevented? Those answers would depend on the results of the ongoing investigation, including the medical examination and any additional findings that could clarify the sequence of events. Until then, there was a clear line between fact and uncertainty. And the biggest question still remains. What makes a case like this difficult to understand isn't just what happened, it's how it was able to go unnoticed for so long. To see that clearly, you have to step away from the details of the discovery for a moment and look at the structure surrounding it. Mykryra Clemons was not living independently. She relied on a caregiver for daily needs, communication, and supervision. That kind of arrangement creates a very specific dynamic, one where responsibility and authority sit in the same place. On one hand, caregiving can be demanding. It requires time, consistency, and patience. It often means putting someone else's needs ahead of your own, day after day. For many people, that responsibility can become overwhelming over time. But on the other hand, caregiving also creates control. The person providing care becomes the primary decision maker. They determine routines, access, and information. They are often the only person who sees what happens behind closed doors on a daily basis. And when that role is not shared or regularly checked by others, the balance can shift without anyone realizing it. That's where the risk begins. When one person controls both care and communication, it becomes difficult for others to challenge what they're being told. Trust plays a major role. Families want to believe that the person responsible is doing what's right. That belief can make it harder to question inconsistencies early on. In this case, the explanation that Mykryra was with another caregiver was accepted, at least initially, because it came from someone who was expected to know. That's how situations like this remain hidden. Not because no one cares, but because the structure makes it harder to see what's really happening. It's a shift from visibility to dependence, from shared responsibility to a single point of control. And when something goes wrong inside that structure, it doesn't always become visible right away. By the time it does, the situation has already changed in a way no one expected. Cases like this don't just leave behind questions about what happened inside one apartment. They raise something bigger about how situations like this are allowed to continue without being seen. At the center of it is trust. Trust is what allows families to function. It's what allows one person to step into a caregiving role, while others step back, believing everything is being handled. It creates a sense of security. But when that trust exists without accountability, it can also create blind spots. In Mykryra's case, the system depended on one voice. If that voice said she was safe, there was no immediate reason to doubt it. If that voice said she was somewhere else, that explanation was accepted, at least at first. And because there was no regular, independent way to confirm her condition, the situation remained unchanged for longer than it should have. That's where the risk becomes clear. Vulnerable individuals, especially those who rely on others for daily care, need more than trust. They need visibility. They need consistent contact with more than one person. They need a structure where their well-being isn't tied to a single source of information. Because when that structure isn't in place, silence becomes harder to interpret. A missed call might not mean anything on its own. A delayed visit might be explained away. But when those gaps begin to stretch over time, they become something else. A warning. In this case, the silence lasted weeks. And during that time, there was no direct confirmation that Mykryra was okay. No moment where someone outside that immediate environment could verify what they were being told. That's why one of the most important takeaways from this story is simple. Verification matters. Not out of distrust, but out of responsibility. Asking questions, checking in, requesting to see or speak to someone directly. Those actions can feel uncomfortable at times, but they create a layer of protection that trust alone cannot provide. There's also a role for the broader community. Situations involving vulnerable individuals shouldn't exist in isolation. The more connected someone is, to family, to neighbors, to people who can notice when something changes, the harder it becomes for problems to remain hidden. Because ultimately, what happened here wasn't a sudden disappearance. She didn't vanish. She was hidden. And that distinction changes everything. When you look back at the beginning of this story, it started with a simple statement. She's safe. That's what the family was told. A sentence meant to reassure. A sentence meant to close the conversation. But by the end, that same sentence carries a different weight. Because safety isn't just what someone says. It's what can be seen, confirmed, and known. Mykryra Clemons was a young woman who depended on others for care, for protection, and for honesty. She deserved consistency. She deserved visibility. And above all, she deserved to be accounted for. Instead, her story became one of silence, delay, and a truth that stayed hidden until it couldn't anymore. And now, it leaves behind a question that doesn't just belong to this case, it belongs to anyone hearing it. How long would it take before you started asking more questions? If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. These are the stories that need to be told.